Welcome to this discussion on soft news and inattentive public. We are going to examine this topic using Matthew Baum's 2002 piece. I will specifically be focusing on the methods in this article because I want to articulate aspects of the article review that are necessary for the assignment's completion. Obviously, we will discuss the literature review and the theory and how this ties to American foreign policy, but I want to focus on methods so that we can complete the article reviews effectively. So what is the uninformed public? So that's not someone sitting in my class. It's not me, because we're taking a class on foreign policy. You care enough about policy to not find a substitute class for foreign policy or international conflict or terrorism or international relations. You care about politics. The uninformed public, if you're not sure, go to YouTube, find a video of your favorite comedian interviewing average Americans and asking civic questions. Now, obviously, these are edited. People who give the right answer probably are not on there, so it's a biased sample. But even with a biased sample, some of the answers are shocking. So go find those. That's the uninformed, inattentive public. This kind of idea that the public is uninformed or inattentive actually has basis in scholarship. Early conceptions of public opinion for domestic policy, those by Converse and Ullman and Lippmann, argued that public opinion was incoherent. And if it's incoherent, it's inconsistent, it's irrelevant for policymaking. I'm skipping a whole bunch, but fasting forward to Zoller in the 90s, he argued that public opinion can actually be shaped by elites and elite messaging, and that how someone receives the messaging by the elites is based on individual characteristics, so you can have coherent public opinion. If we fast forward to Stimson in the 2000s, they would argue that public opinion can change in predictable ways based on government policies, and that opinion is influential. How that relates to foreign policy is that attitudes initially thought to be informed and unresponsive, we've actually shown that foreign policy attitudes can be formed and influence your vote choice. So we can think of these as hawks and doves in particular. If you think of that continuum we've examined in other portions of the class, if you tend to think that most solutions have a military solution internationally, or most solutions do not, that's a continuum, and your foreign policy ends up being consistent based on your own preferences. So what does Matthew Baum do in this piece? He argues that foreign policy crises likely transcend partisanship. This is an older piece, but this may still hold, right? At least initially, if it's something that captures the imagination, it can transcend partisan borders. And then finally, the American public in general is likely to ignore foreign policy news. So it's a test of how much soft news influences thought processes, because most of the public doesn't pay attention to it. Okay? We think of rational ignorance. Now, we talk about this in scholarship. Foreign policy, in many ways, may not impact someone's daily life. So you may not, or I may not, care about certain areas of foreign policy because we can only focus so much of our time. That's the rational ignorance component. Don't confuse it. It's not an insult. It's simply saying that we've done rational calculations on what we care about, and sometimes foreign policy isn't there. We think about soft news and content. What does soft news usually cover? Human interest stories, framing, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So how does soft news potentially inform the public? Well, part of this could be passive learning, an incidental byproduct as a model of consumption. We think about passive learning, you're exposed to it, you pick up on it. We think about how media transmits information. You may go to a media source to laugh, but you're going to be informed. So the genre of news information from The Daily Show and others, when we think through that, most people would initially turn in to be entertained a little bit, but you get news, right? So whether it's John Oliver or The Daily Show is still on, and it's still information. But are you turning to it for information, or are you turning to it for soft news? Now we think about some of this. What happens with the show? What does Trevor Noah's jokes tell us? Well, sometimes it's piggybacking, right? It's conveying information, but it's still humorous. Well, what soft news investigates is that human impact, morality, and injustice are the most common frames for soft news. And so there are differences in the types of coverage that soft news carries. And the example used in the text is Clinton-Lewinsky versus Sudan and Afghanistan, the missile attacks that occurred, the United States launched against those two. Those types of instances are conveyed very differently, whether it's soft news or hard news. So take a moment, go look at table 1 on what soft news is and what hard news is, because it matters as we think through this. If we think about incidental attention, it generated 4 different hypotheses. So I've copied and pasted those hypotheses for your review in the slides as well as in the argument. So go take a look at those. Now, I breezed through kind of the frame of this and the argument, so you do need to read through this. Now we'll be very intentional about the methods component of this article. First, there's 5 dependent variables, and they're all based on foreign policy crises that have public opinion polling. Israel, Lebanon, anti-terrorism debate, Bosnia, conflict in Northern Ireland, and the peace process in Northern Ireland. When we think about the methods, we want to identify how soft news influences someone's understanding of foreign policy crisis. Does exposure to soft news increase your understanding? Right, that's the basic research question. We think about the methods. You need to identify the methods are typically organized around the dependent variable, because the dependent variable tells us how we can estimate models to understand it. In this case, many of the estimates are ordered logit, which simplistically means that there's categories that are ordinal that we want to investigate. And that makes perfect sense for this analysis, because think about what we're trying to measure. We're trying to measure how much a person cares about or understands about the Israeli-Lebanon conflict. Well, those are going to be asked in questions of, do you know about this? Yes, a little bit, a lot, extensively. Those are naturally ordinal scales, so we can investigate them. The other component is one of the key controls/explanatory variables is an indicator of attentiveness. How much do you already pay attention to the news? Because we don't want to capture 2 different groups of people. We don't want to capture in the same without controlling for people who watch the news all the time, right? Who are very much informed and very much attentive to what's going on in foreign policy. We want to be able to make sure that when we examine soft news, that we capture the person that says, "Where's Northern Ireland?" We don't want the person who's mapped out a peace process. Okay? We want to make sure we can control for that. So look at the index and the soft news index. I really do. I want you to pause the video, go look at it. Right? We're going to look at it on the next slide, but I want you to really kind of think about, what does soft news mean? Here are items of soft and hard news. So pause this and take a look at it. Think through where, update 18 years, which is a very long time. Where does social media fit in this? Obviously, it's mostly soft news, but how are they reporting soft news and hard news? How do you get most of your information on the world? So pause that for a minute. As you come back to the video, we are not going to study the method or look at the figures or the charts, even though we're on the methods heavy component. So when you do an article review, you do need to look at the substantive effect. This article, just like most of what we read, has sentences where the discussion is very clear that if you are exposed to X amount of soft news, you expect an increase in the knowledge by a certain percentage. Those are the sentences that you need to translate into the article reviews. Or cut and paste them, but cite the page and the author. All right, don't plagiarize, but these authors write well. Take that one sentence. What you need to be able to do, and what I want us to be able to do, is to clearly find those substantive effects, because those are the policy relevant indicators. Right? We want to make sure that what we're studying and what we're finding in our scholarship has real meaning. And we can do this well in this article with the graphs. So what you see in this table, which is the probability of following a foreign crisis more than not at all. Okay, so how to think about that? What this analyzes is moving someone from the category of, I don't follow this foreign policy crisis at all, to the other categories. I follow it a little, I follow it some, I follow it a lot. What you see is 3 of the dependent variable, anti-terrorism debate, Bosnia, and the Israeli-Lebanon, and the predicted probability effect of soft news coverage. So how to read these? So if we start in the lower left-hand corner, the anti-terrorism debate, you see 4 lines, and they all trend from low to high on soft news exposure. So from moving from left to right, that's an increase in soft news coverage. What that is showing you is someone who on the left would say, so right here would say there's no, I don't really watch soft news. On this side, they watch a lot of soft news. Well, as you can see, regardless of where you start, soft news generally increases how much you know about the phenomenon, but it's not proportional per category. And this is what I think is so fascinating about this work. The solid line dramatically moves up. If you watch a lot of soft news and you typically are not following foreign policy events, your exposure to soft news dramatically increases the probability that you have seen and followed the topic. That's what this larger slope, this more gradient slope shows you. Now, if you already follow it very closely, this top line, if you already follow a foreign policy crisis generally, soft news doesn't have much of an effect. And as you will see with the middle categories, these lines here, that it increases it, but it's not as much. So what these show is a dramatic increase in following foreign policy events given your soft news exposure. Next is the role of education, looking at Northern Ireland. And it's important here that education is not, it's a proxy for an indicator of political engagement. So what the author does is argue that political engagement is highly correlated, and it is, with education. And so education can act as a proxy for political engagement. And because what we want to really show is, in the ideal test, it might be exposure to soft news and your likelihood to vote. But the surveys weren't done with this study in mind. Now, there have been other studies that look at this, and we'll look at this towards the end. And so what this is trying to say is it's a proxy for political engagement. And look at the graphs. Again, moving from left to right, you see soft news exposure. That means more of it is on the right-hand side. And primary school, high school, college, and graduate. What this is showing you that if you only have a primary education, this one right here, you're exposed to soft news, it dramatically increases your likelihood of political engagement. Education, similarly, if we look up here, if you are college educated or you have a graduate level degree, the likelihood that soft news influences political engagement is small. And the reason for that is you likely are already politically engaged. These graphs have huge ramifications. If they're true, right? Remember, this is just one article. That's not how science is done. We don't just take one article and say, this is the truth, right? But there's continuing evidence that exposure to media matters, and there's a lot of other pieces we could study, and I encourage you to read, that suggest some of these things. So to conclude, people do learn a lot about high-profile foreign policy events through soft news, but they do not learn about other less accessible or dramatic issues. If the cost to gathering in the information is too high, people don't tend to engage in it. I think this is an important finding because public opinion can influence foreign policy. And so depending on percentages of population, soft news can be influential. All right. We think about this as it relates to the discussion questions. Here is discussion number 6. So as you come across this lecture, as you're going through material, this needs to go in, your answer to the set of questions needs to go into question 6. First, read that quote and think about Baum. Identify at least 2 implications for the mass public. Here I want you to think, what are the effects for elections? What are the effects for public policy formation? What are the effects for specific policies? And given what you have identified for implications, how do we think about the mass public today? How do we update this study? How do we think about crises, foreign policy crises, in today's constant entertainment ecosystem? So if Pryor is right and Baum are right, so let's make the assumption that they're both right, and they might not be. I think there's evidence to suggest they are, but they might not be. If they're both right, what are the implications for the mass public in foreign policy events? It's good. Thank you for listening. Just like always, if you have questions, contact me. Thanks.